Hey everyone! Today we plan on covering one of the most fundamental parts of the 3D art pipeline, material workflows. We'll look into what makes up a material, how to properly use reference, render settings, how to create a lighting setup for look dev, and understanding beginner to advanced concepts in material workflows, and more. I will be using Maya 2020.4 and Arnold to Maya 5 for this tutorial, but know that these tutorials can transfer to any software as well as any render engine. So with that, let's get right into it. So here we are in Maya, and what I have here is my DAT-Sun 240Z on a clean background. I have the Arnold render view, and then I have the hypershade here. All this setup is just, if you go to the left and right click, this is just two panels stacked with the Arnold render engine docked here. So you can also use pure ref here. I'll be pulling that up a lot. So if you click here, right click hold, you can kind of move that around and that'll always stay on top, so you can always look at your reference. So this is the setup that I'm using, as well as having my render settings here on the right. I figured this was the best and most convenient way to be able to show everybody on a single screen this entire workflow. I will be using this DAT-Sun for this tutorial, as well as a couple of simple spheres. If you're interested in downloading this model, I have this available on my ArtStation store right here. So you can just find that and download it, but you really don't need it unless you want to download it and do some renderings and whatnot with it. You can use any model that you have to follow along with this tutorial. So I have the model and environment all set up, and I have some already pre-made materials, but I will go through creating materials for the majority of this, but it's not going to be every single material on the DAT-Sun. What I always recommend doing is hiding your model and just starting with a couple of simple spheres. So if I hold shift and right click, I can create a sphere and scale it up and kind of put it in position here, as well as duplicating it. But I do want to increase the subdivision, so I will go to my channel box editor and enter 64. So it's going to be a nice smooth sphere. Hit Control D to duplicate and then move that. And so now we have a couple of simple spheres. I'll actually go ahead and do 3. So now we have 3 spheres, and I'm going to use that to kind of create my initial lighting and look dev. And we can start taking a look at these material properties. Now, the primary material we will be using is going to be the Arnold standard surface. So if I hold right click and assign a new material here, you can see that I can just open up my assign new material window and go down to Arnold, or really I believe it's just favorites here, or Arnold, and just find standard surface. Now if you do the AI standard surface, which were in previous versions, it'll pretty much give you all the same settings as the standard surface, but we want to just stick with the standard surface, which is the Arnold material. And the first thing I will do is just call this M for material, and then I will just call this, gray ball. So gray ball, and this will be our gray ball. And for this gray ball, you can see that we have, base, specular, and transmission. And we also have subsurface, coat, sheen. There's just a lot of information here, right? So when learning materials, it helps just to kind of go one by one, and instead of just moving sliders in a bunch of different order, okay? So if I now pull up my reference here, I have this peer ref here that shows what goes into creating a final material, which includes, of course, the camera position, the lighting, shadows, and everything, right? So you have all of these material layers, right? You have specular reflection at the top, which is coating. You have emission, which is glowing. Then you have transparency, which we won't be using, since we're going to be using what's called, instead of transparency, we're going to be using transmission, which you can see here. So specular transmission and then diffuse transmission. And then we have specular reflection for metals, and then specular reflections for non-metals, and then specular transmission. And so we're going to be looking at creating these materials with all of these properties here. And if you start to really understand all of these properties that go into it, you'll know that materials are more than just base colors with highlights. I've been teaching for a long time, and when students first start out, their first thing to do is just change the base color, throw on a texture, and then maybe give it a little bit of a highlight and then move on. There's no normal detail, there's no noise, there's no transmission if need be, there's no coding, right? So now Arnold and all these render engines have made it incredibly easy to essentially give you what's essentially called an uber material. So it's just super material that just contains all of this information, when previously, and this was just a few years ago, you'd have to create just a multi-layered blended material in order to get this. But all of these render engines now just give it to you pretty much in one standard material. There are of course other material properties, but we're going to be just looking at this. So once you know that, and you plan to go layer by layer, essentially, you're going to just automatically start really creating really nice looking materials. So the next thing that, of course, is once you understand what goes into the material, is having just reference and reference. You can see I have a fairly large pure ref board here, this mood board, and it shows a lot of close-ups on the wheels. It shows the body paint, it shows the chromes. So this was after hours of just researching and finding all of these different angles of what goes into making materials. And this is absolutely like required, right? People just want to go in and just start creating plastics and metals and chromes without actually knowing what the final look should be, right? So again, once you're building this mood board out and you can say, okay, now I'm going to do the metal on the wheel, you have an easily accessible mood board here using something like PureRef, right? Or if I want to create, plastics or rubbers or clear coats and all of that is here and ready to go. So spend that time at the beginning gathering these reference and as many close shots as you possibly can. And it doesn't even have to be the model itself. It can just be you're looking for material properties here, as well as lighting properties and modeling properties and all of that. All right. So now that we have this reference all ready to go, we can finally start creating some lights. So I will start out by going to the top left under my Arnold tab and hitting area light. Once I create that area light and hit W for move, and just kind of move and hit R for scale and scale that up, I now have something that can help illuminate my screen, because otherwise it's just going to appear black. So if I hit now play, so if you do this red icon play button, this will do the interactive progressive render, which just means that it will continuously render until you tell it to stop. The other method is just straight single render. So if you hit refresh render, it'll go ahead and render, but you can see that everything's black, right? So I will hit escape to stop that render because I already know why that's doing that. And actually finished up, I can go back to IPR and I have to increase the exposure. You can see exposure is set to 0. Now, when you're first using Arnold, your first bet may be just to set this to, increase this intensity value like 100 or 1000, but that's not going to work until you give it an exposure value, because the thing that you need to understand is that intensity is a linear value and exposure is an exponential value. It's 2 to the power of whatever this is here. So the way I typically do this is I'll set this maybe right off the gate at like intensity of 10, or frankly, you can leave it at 1, and I just start increasing the exposure, and I'll set the exposure at minimum, something like 10, right? And then I can start to increase that even more. And then you can see once you get to 15 and 16, it really starts to give light to the scene. Now, I typically will set this to about 100 for intensity, and then I'll lower my exposure, because the reason I do that is because by setting this exposure here and then the intensity allows me to fine tune this. So now you can see once I set this, maybe this exposure just to start to something like 10, I can use this slider now to get a little bit more precision. Otherwise, if I'm using this and then I try to slide my exposure, like I'll bring this back down to like 100 or 90 and then increase the exposure, look what happens. It's very sensitive in relative to each other. So again, linear values for intensity and exponential values for exposure. So I will set this back at 100 intensity, and I'll set the exposure again to something like 13. Now that I have this initial light and I can easily see what's going on, I want to set this up with a nice simple light setup, okay? And I covered this in the past here. Actually, it was just the tutorial maybe a couple of videos ago where I do, lighting 3D models, how to improve your renders, but I ended up using V-Ray for this. And for those that are using V-Ray, don't worry, I plan to create a bunch of V-Ray for my tutorials. I just wanted to start this one with Arnold, and then I'll bounce essentially back between these two render engines. But please just understand that these workflows can be entirely translated between the different render engines, because I'm going to set this up very similarly to what I did for V-Ray. So I'm going to kind of create this key light that's large and It depends, of course, based off your camera angle, right? So if I have this camera here, and I'll select my camera that I already have set up, and if I go to the channel box editor, you can see that I have a locator here, and there it is. So it's all the way back here for this camera. So I'm going to just bring this in, and if I know that this is my key camera here and I'll be rendering from this angle, then I want to make sure that that key light is off to the side or off to an angle from that. Now you may be noticing I'm using the perspective camera and I'm using perspective in here. So in order to change cameras, you can go to render cam shape, and I can switch my panels to render cam, and I can get this more in position here. So this is a very long focal length camera, and I can get something like this just to start. And from here, now I can kind of set this up like so. And if I go back to perspective, I can move around freely without messing up and moving the camera here. So again, I'm just going to now just start positioning this in that kind of 3-point setup. So I have this key light here, and I'll hit Control D to duplicate. And I always create this just nice top light that's going to give you some nice reflections, especially for this car where you're going to have a lot of nice body lines popping with this top light. And you can, use your scale tool, kind of scale that out, and we can kind of move that up. And I'll hit Control D again and just kind of move this. And this is all, I'm going through this pretty fast, but this is all based off those workflows that I covered in the last tutorial. And what this is going to be the backdrop light. And this is essentially going to act like my fill light. So I have this here, I have my top light, and I can start to give this a little bit of, thinness here, make it a little bit thinner. And we get something like this, and everything's looking okay. It's very flat. There's not a lot of contrast or a lot of highlights here. And so now I can start working on my intensities. It also helps to rename your light. So if I have AI area light, I'll do underscore key. I'll select the next light, area 2, and I'll call this top. And then I'll call this rim or back or whatever you want to call it. So I'll call this rim light. And so now I have these 3 lights set up where I can actually just start seeing what I have. All right. Now that I have these lights set up, now I can start doing the look dev that I was talking about, where I can go through now and start looking at these materials. Now, don't worry, none of this lighting is final. The materials aren't final. We're just getting started in building this from scratch. Now, you may have noticed I only applied the standard surface to this leftmost sphere here. And if I select the next one, I can add more materials, right? So I will just select the sphere, and I'll call it, sphere gray. So call that gray. And then I'll call this one, my chrome. And then I'll call this, plastic or gloss. So I'm creating these materials to help me with my lighting and look dev. But we first need to create that kind of initial rough lighting so we can start modifying and of course creating materials, because we can't create materials unless we actually see what's going on. So I have this rough light set up, and I have this material, and now I can go into looking at the materials. So if I hit Control A, you can see that I have this standard surface gray ball, and I can either mess with it in the attribute editor. So you'll see me working in this, which is the attribute editor. You can just hit Control A to open that up, or you can find it here right in the hypershade. And in order to open the hypershade, if you don't have that up, just hit this little icon here. I'm not going to hit it here because it'll undock it here, but yeah, this will give me exactly what I need. And I will now pull this up, and we have gray ball. So the first thing I'll do is use what's called weight, and I'm going to turn on IPR, or our IPR is running, and so then I can increase this weight to 1. Now this is going to give me a full 1.0 value. I typically always start here with a full value of 1 because I don't want to start with a lower value, because again, weight is going to be impacting and affecting our color. So if I want something that's pure white with a weight of 0.8, then it's not going to be fully white, right? Or fully black, or whatever color that you're working for. Now, then within base here, I have color. Obviously, if I change the color, it's going to change the diffuse or the base color, and this is called a lot of different things. So this is called sometimes diffuse, base color, albedo. Just understand that color is the color of the material with no lighting whatsoever. So you want to make sure that you always set this to, whatever closest color that you want. And I'm creating a gray ball. So I can set the saturation back to 0. So you can click on the icon and you can see I have HSV, so that's hue, so that's color, S for saturation, and V for value. You just set that to 0 and we're good to go for white. And then you can simply drag this slider down and kind of get more of this gray ball. Now for a nice solid, gray, if you go pretty dark here, 0.18, you'll see actually within linear color space is going to give you half right here within this color space, this rendering color space. Then you have like display, which is actually the display space, but we'll use rendering space, which 0.18 will give you exactly half. That's why you always may have noticed that whenever you're changing, you're like, wow, I want to set this to a really dark value, but it won't change, until here. You really have to drag it over, right? And so again, if I leave this at 0.18, that gives me a perfect mid-gray. All right, and so that looks good for base color. And then now we can take a look at specular. Now specular is your highlights, and it's called different things in different render engines. Specular could be, glossiness, or specular, or roughness, or reflection, and all of these parameters are within the specular area. So again, I will just set this weight back to 1 because I want to, not have this impacting the overall color. And you can see that we have color. Now, if I start to change color, it will change not the color of the object, but it'll change the color of only the highlights. So now you can see actually if I get in a little bit closer here, so I'm going to stop this and switch to perspective cam and go back to rendering just so we can get in a little bit closer and it'll more interactively update. So you can see all my highlights here are starting to look red, right? So of course, now a nice trick is if you just drag this to the left, it'll turn it black, and then you can set it back to white when you drag. So it won't be like a dark red, but you have to drag it all the way back. Once I do that, I can kind of move this over and then we have this nice color. Now, of course, we have weight and color, then we have roughness, right? And that, if we take a look in our pure ref, that's what this icon, this nice simple image here, right? Because the roughness is essentially microfaceting within the surface. And when highlights come, the rougher the surface, the more essentially jagged these lines are and exaggerated, right? So if you have something rough like rubber or really matte plastic, these would be really, really large. If you have something very smooth, it would be less intense, right? So the light's coming down, bouncing within this microfacet surface here, and then spreading this reflection. That is the difference between having something like a polished chrome versus something like a satin aluminum or a satin steel, okay? So I'll kind of dock this for now, and we'll come back to that reference later. And then if I drag this, so you'll see that the roughness defaults to 0.4. I can drag this to 0, and there we go. You get this nice looking, gray ball. Now everything's pretty gray, so what I want to do is actually go back to my lighting and increase the lighting. And what you can do is, I have this docked here on my shelf, but if you go to Arnold, Utilities, I like to use the light manager. So if you hit Control Shift and left click, it'll just add it to your Arnold shelf. I don't know why it's not there by default because I had to add this myself, but it's a really, really good utility. It's a really, really good tool. And I'll bring this over and I can just start affecting and changing these values of the lights all here without bouncing back and forth. So it's just a really nice thing. This is equivalent to the light lister inside of V-Ray. So as you can see, I will now start increasing my key light. You can see I'll have to definitely increase the exposure. I'm going to set this to something like 15. So we're getting a lot more contrast. Now, typically your rim and your tops, you're not going to have those as bright as your key light, but I will increase those a bit too to something like 14. All right. So we get something like this. And so now we start to say, okay, we're getting this gray ball here that looks gray because this background, for reference, is a white background, right? So this is a white background. And you can see the difference between this gray and this white background. So this is giving me that nice difference. If, I wasn't paying attention and my lights weren't nearly as intense, then, your grays are going to start looking, very dark, and your whites are going to start looking as dark. And then sometimes if you're too bright, right? If I go up here and set this to like 18, maybe not something that drastic, but if if you're not careful, your whites will get blown out. and then your grays will get too bright and your blacks won't be right. So you have to be careful when it comes to setting these initial values up. So again, I will set this back to 15 to something like this, and we'll just kind of work within these light parameters here. And now that we have that, I can set up this gray ball material here, and we can just kind of go through and set this. Now, I don't want this to be a polished ball, so instead I'll bring this back up where we're just getting some nice highlights. I don't want 0.4, I think that was too matte, but we just want enough just to have these rough reflections, and that'll be good. So you can see the gray here, and then you can see the gray here on the attribute editor. So looking between our render engine and the color here that I set to a perfect, value using, again, render space. This is not, using display space, because if, again, I did, that's 0.5 for display space. So it's better just to stick with rendering. And we can talk about color space and linear color space in future tutorials, but I at least want to make sure you understand this part of it. And why, when I set 0.18 or 0.18 and call it mid-gray, that's because it's using the linear color space. All right, so we have this and we have our nice gray ball. The next thing I want to do is take a look at creating, from a plastic ball to this chrome ball. All right, so I will go over here to the attribute editor, and you can see that has a Lambert shader. So I will hold right click, assign a new material, and I will then just find standard surface under Arnold, or actually I think it's under favorites, but yeah, standard surface. And we can call this M Chrome. All right, so I will set these values to from 0.8 to 1, and I will set the weight of the specular to 1 again. And you can see this right here is, considered fully white, right? As in, this is full value 1, and this is specular highlights 1. So everything's looking good. It still looks bright, it still looks white, but it's not being blown out. And this is where your lighting is going to be very important. If I bring back my light manager here, and if this was just a hair brighter, things will just start clipping and looking really, really bad. All right, so we have that. Now, of course, I can make this brighter here with 15 exposure and just start dragging over the intensity. So I start to get, some nicer highlights. But this is why you want to kind of start with this mid-gray, this white, and then we'll do the plastic here in a second. All right. So, but I called this chrome, right? So we want to make this a chrome ball. So if I go now to, the base, this is where you say, yeah, I want to give this metalness. I want this to be a metal object. The thing that you need to understand is that when it comes to materials, there are dielectrics, and then there are essentially non-dielectrics or conductive materials. So, the key thing is, I like to bring this up, even though, these are these science terms, and I'm trying not to get too technical, is that it's either metal or it's not, right? And so you have to be careful. Like, I don't recommend people using in between values here and say, oh, well, I want to make this darker or lighter or give it some, non-correct value. When you start doing that, things start to look, not photorealistic, not physically correct. There's, of course, now I'm not saying this is the hard set rule. Obviously, there are times where you have to, you may want to change those, but I haven't had many of those opportunities. So long story short, it's either metal or it's not. So I can go here to metalness, and you can see 0, it looks like a plastic or a dielectric material. And then I hit 1, and there you go. 1 will immediately just set this to a metalness value. All right, a metal material. So I do highly recommend, there's this Chaos blog that really talks about metalness and kind of the background. And really the key thing is just understanding that this is crucial for your PBR workflow. All right. So, and when it comes to metallic objects, is that, it's a little bit misleading with PBR, because you're like, oh, well, if I want gold, I'll just set this to, or brass or whatever, I'll just set these materials like so. But there's a lot more going behind the scenes. Metal technically doesn't have a base color or diffuse color. It's, these wavelengths that are being absorbed by the metal and then being reflected back. So it's always coming down to what's being reflected back when it comes to metalness. But we don't have to worry about that as artists. We just say, hey, I want this to be brown or gold or yellow or green or blue, and you get like anodized metal, which is like magnetized metal. Okay, so all of that is hopefully, bettering your understanding of, the metalness workflow. And so we're just setting this to 1, and I'll set this to black, and then I'm gonna increase the color from there. Okay, and so we have this with, again, a weight of 1 and kind of this color here. And for metals, I really don't go full white, full bright color. I always kind of keep it off white here. So, maybe more something kind of mid or light gray. And same thing with the specular. I'll keep this at 1, and then I'll set the weight to 1, and then I'll mess with the roughness. I definitely encourage, at least this is my workflow, and it's always worked well. And I do this within pretty much all render engines where, some of them don't even, well, yeah, I guess some of them do have weight, but you have weight here. I'll always set that to 1 and then color to full white. Then I'll mess with the roughness, right? And you can see if I increase that, it really starts to lose its value because it actually doesn't even look metallic anymore, right? The reason why it doesn't look metallic is because metallic objects are, based off of reflection. So if I start to bring that back, I think the highest I'd ever go for a metallic object is probably like 0.6. I keep around the 0.5, 0.6 for like the absolute extreme. But for, more reflective objects, obviously setting it something down like this is going to give me, essentially a perfectly polished chrome ball. All right. So, you can kind of drag this and kind of mess with it. And you can start to see once you get to the, 0.2 areas, it really starts to give you this nice spread of reflections. You have 0.1, which it's still very reflective, but you start to get blurrier reflections, and then 0. So, I won't be, using anisotropy or rotation, but I mean, actually, if I just, set anisotropy to 1, you'll see nothing happens because it's based off of rotation. And this is how you kind of get that kind of anodized or rotating the reflections here. And in order to get anisotropy to work, I would increase the roughness so you start to blur and it really starts spreading the reflection. So maybe like 0.1, 0.15, excuse me. And then from there, then with a full value of anisotropy of 1, then you have the rotation now, which you can see the reflection is starting to rotate. All right. And if you're just starting to kind of learn about 3D, if you head, to Google and look up anisotropy metal example, it's this type of effect where, if this was just, kind of coated and clear, you'd have kind of this nice, perfect, or at least blurry reflection. But with anisotropy, this is rotating the reflection. So that's what that is. I won't be using that here, but just understand that's how you can affect a specular. So I'll go ahead and I will set these back to 0 and keep the roughness, something really low, just maybe not perfect, but we'll keep this at 0.05. All right. So with this gives me my nice chrome ball. And then here, I can now create my glossy or shiny plastic. So I will right click and assign a new material. And of course, find my standard surface, assign that. And, I can call this, M underscore, coated plastic. Okay, so we have this. So kind of walking through. So you can create this, if you want this to be colored plastic or white or blue, it really doesn't matter. Right? So let's just set this weight back to 1, and I'll set this to mid gray, and you'll see that I have now the specular here. I'll set that back to 1 and increase the color and kind of bring down this roughness here. And because this is a dielectric material, I don't have to change the metalness and whatnot. And I can start to get this nice material here where it's already just really looking like a nice simple plastic. Now, there are a couple things you can do where sometimes if you look at different types of plastics, some plastics will have like a really rough material. So the roughness will be pretty high, maybe 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, something like that. But it still looks shiny. That's because it has a special plastic coating. Now, in order to get that, we can go down to coat. And within coat, this is where we can increase and give this nice, rough plastic a special coating. And I will, just go back to here. This is all based off of, what goes into a material where you have, again, coating, metallic specular, regular specular reflection, or I should say dielectric, non-dielectric. And then you have transmission and whatnot. And so we'll kind of get into those once we start building the car out. All right. So with this now, I can give this coat now a weight of 1, and watch that. So you start to get this really nice coating reflection on the base, or excuse me, on top of the base. And you can, set this to near perfect. I wouldn't go full near perfect, but I'd keep it nice and low, around 0.1 or lower. And what we can do now is change actually the base color here. So if I go to the base, I can start with maybe this nice off blue, kind of teal blue, lower the saturation a bit, lower the value, and there you go. You get something that looks like this. And, this is going to give us a good start for our look dev. This is obviously not all of the material properties. We're going to get into that as we start making the cards. But I think once you get to this point where you create a nice mid-gray ball, a chrome ball, and a plastic, and it could be a colored plastic and whatnot, you can use that to really refine your look dev, right? And so now you can say, all right, well, for anything that's really polished and reflective, you can actually start altering the lights and changing the lights. One thing that I really like to do for these lights, especially for this more of this studio look, is sometimes you can apply soft boxes to the light. So now we're looking at kind of refining the lighting a bit. So I can grab this, and one of my favorite things within Arnold, within the AI area lights, is giving this a softer edge. And what this is going to do is, you'll just, I'll zoom in even closer so you can really see it. It's starting to just soften the edge here. And that is a fantastic, easy way to do it. And just gives you this nice effect. And I mean, you can even increase roundness and essentially create a nice soft circle, right? So this is going to give you, that, nice softer lighting here and really give you that nice studio effect. Because a lot of times I'll look at a lot of renders and everything's just super crisp and perfect. And that's not how it is in the real world, right? You have these soft boxes here that are, giving you that nice soft lighting. Not everything's going to look, perfectly square and perfectly cut out. So whenever you're doing lighting, I would recommend just at minimum giving this a little bit of a soft edge. And you can just go through now and start doing this with kind of the roundness here and giving this more of a soft edge. So we have this nice soft top here. And really for our, backlight here, it's really not going to matter too much, but I'll also go ahead and soften that a bit. So we get that effect. And just know it will, slightly impact the intensity, but this gives us a good start and nice softer lighting. All right. So I will stop this render here. And the next thing that I want to do is, especially since I'm doing, more of these automotive materials, it really doesn't matter though, is I want to bring in an HDR. All right. So let's jump to my favorite site to grab HDRs, which is, Polyhaven. So Polyhaven completely free, and you can download. This is the one that I will be using, which is a Studio Small 09. And you can really grab whatever you want, just kind of understand whatever you're grabbing. So I'm grabbing a 4K HDR, downloading that. I already have this downloaded, but if you're following along, you can grab this. And with this now, I can add in this nice dome light. And the way that I want to do that is create a dome light. So you'll notice I stopped IPR, so nothing's going to be updating here. It's just from a stability standpoint, I always, stop IPR whenever I'm adding things like skylights or dome lights. Then I can scale this up. And I'll scale this up, nothing too crazy, maybe something like, 5 or 10, and we get something like this. Now, I will hit Control A within the skylight, and I'm going to leave everything default. So the color or the intensity, I'll leave at default. Resolution, you can increase that if you want, but I'm going to leave that as is. And I will set the color to a bitmap or a file. So if you go here just to file, just grab a file and go to image name, and I can grab the Studio Small 4K and hit open, and you can see we get this nice studio lighting setup, and there we go. It loads in super fast, and I will rotate this around where I want more of a fill light actually on coming from the left of the camera. So if I select my camera, again, the camera is kind of over here, out here with a long focal length. That's why it's like really far back, because it has 120 focal length. And I would want my hot light here to kind of rotate. I'll keep rotating that. Oh, not my camera, my HDR. So it's just a little bit tight here. So we get something like this. You know, it depends on how much light. Because I have this key light here, I don't want this to also affect my key light. So I'll just keep moving this until I get now this. Now I'm doing this again without the IPR because I've already kind of gone through this. But this is at least my thought process as to why I set this HDR and why I brought it in. And then now I can start rendering. Now, what I also recommend is I haven't touched render settings. This is all using default render settings. So now if I head over to render settings, oops, and bring that back, you can see what I'm using. These are, again, the default settings, which camera A, 3, diffuse 2, specular 2, transmission 2. Everything's kind of set to 2, which will work fine. And then now, if I zoom in a little bit closer, hit IPR, now this is going to take a little bit longer. Actually, the other thing that I want to do, at least in my case, is the rendering device is set to GPU or CPU. I want to change this to GPU because I have an RTX 3090 that I just want to do all of the rendering while my CPU remains, free to use mine, do whatever I need it to. So once I do that, I can now do the IPR. And when you do this the first time, when you create an HDR, it creates what's called a .tx file. So it's doing that the first time. It always takes a little bit longer. And there we go. So now you can see it's moving and actually rendering pretty quick. If you were using, CPU, you'll still be fine. I would just, watch your render settings. But now that I've added this HDR, you can see what's happening with my overall lighting. Everything is just blown out, right? This is why I have this look dev setup. So my white background is way blown out. My gray ball is really light gray. My plastic, we're just getting a lot of clipping and highlighting. So I will grab my light manager, bring this over, and I want to just start bringing really these exposures down quite a bit. So I will set my key light to about 12 and the rest of my lights to about 10, right? Because there's just too much light coming in here. All right. And I'm actually going to expand this a bit and do this one at a time so I can really see the impact of the lights, right? So even with this dome light here, we have this dome light enabled with this key light. And if I start bringing this exposure down, we'll see kind of the effect that's going to have. Now, for this car here, I'm actually going to change this background to kind of a black material. But before I do that, I want to get this white nice and balanced here. So I want to take a look at the material for my white background. So if I head over to in the attribute editor for this white material, you can see that I have a standard surface. So I'll just call this M underscore, just background. And you can see what I have here with the specular and the weight and everything. And for this white background, I don't want it to be pure white. You can see that it's just overpowering. So if I start to bring this down, and that's going to help just a little bit, you can see now I start to get this kind of this gray here, which is starting to look a lot better. But what I actually want to do for this lighting, so now you can kind of see we're getting this just nice bright render, and we have this nice white background, and it's looking good. So we're just bringing this white down quite a bit, which, it's just this combined with the bright studio lighting is, a bit much. So by making this background mid-gray, essentially, kind of this mid-gray, this helps really kind of balance everything. Now you see, we still have this bright background, and this gray, is, because it's this falling off into the distance with the light, is giving us a nice effect. And then we also have our gray ball here, which is looking good, our chrome ball and plastic. So I like this, but what I'm ultimately going to do is change this background to a dark black material. So if I'm happy with the lighting here, in this state with it where it's white, I'll actually maybe, you can see my key light, I ended up right about maybe 12. And my area and top lights are 10. And then, of course, my dome light is just 1 intensity. I'm not touching that. That's all now fine. And then, you may want to bring down the intensity of that key light. So now things are starting to look balanced again. Things aren't looking, blown out and overexposed, and this is looking great. All right. So this is what I mean by doing look dev. And you'll notice that I'm doing this again just on these simple spheres. I plan to create a nice cooler looking sphere, a nice shader ball, but they're all over the internet. If you wanted to work in look dev with a shader ball, go ahead. But the spheres will work completely fine. So again, now that I have this, I want this to be now a dark black background. Okay, so we get something like this, where our black background is looking good. And you can now see the contrast between this dark gray and this mid gray. Look at the difference, right? And this is what look dev is. Look dev is just making sure that your lighting is balanced. So your chromes look like chrome, your plastics look like plastics, your gray balls look like gray balls, right? And there's a clear, stark difference between these materials. All right, so I think that about covers really just kind of this intro portion to materials. Now let's take a look at applying these principles to our vehicle model. So now we're going to get, start to get a little bit more advanced. So I'm going to stop the IPR and we're going to bring back our resto mod here. So I will show that with Shift H, and there we go. And you can see I actually have materials already set up, but we're going to go through the process of creating these from scratch. So I think the first thing that we will do now is just start with this nice black plastic based off of our pure ref. You can see if I jump here, this is just a nice, I would say it, doesn't look like it has a clear core, or if it does, it's pretty rough, but I'm going to stick with just a simple base coat. So now we're taking a look at our reference and really understanding, what makes this material up. You can see that the specular highlights too aren't perfect, right? Now, of course, this could be, grained from the camera and whatnot, but I have a couple like really nice close-up shots that really show this from, from all angles, right? So I can zoom in here. So this is kind of, especially you want to take a look at it with a direct light source hitting it. And you'll notice, again, I have this like with outdoor exterior scenes. I have interior garage lighting, so harsher lighting. And so this helps, you do a good breakdown on all these different types of lighting. You'll see actually there's different types, of mod kits here. So I'm not going for this clear coat. I'm going based off of Sung Kang's version here. So knowing now what I know, where I'm going to go for this, matte plastic with, this noise parameter here. We're going to look at now taking our base materials even further by adding, a lot of these, a lot more nodes, or at least a core, set of nodes to really help get more realistic materials. So with that, I will hold right click, and I'm going to move this up here a little bit. I'm going to hold right click and assign a new material. And for this bumper, I'm going to give this a standard surface, and, I'll call it, M, noisy plastic, or it'll probably make more sense to do plastic noisy, because sometimes there's, plastic noise, plastic coated, plastic matte, smooth. There's a lot of different types of grains out there. So this is going to give me what I need. And here's what I have. And within my render settings, let me add actually a couple of AOVs. So these are essentially render elements. So if I do output denoising AOV, then I want to grab a couple of key AOVs. So I want to grab coat, and you can grab coat indirect direct. So it's always good to grab, the diffuse, so albedo indirect direct, and this should be good. I'm not going to be using sheen because I'm not doing vehicle interiors, but I will be using specular. You can grab specular, then direct and indirect. And I won't be using SSS, which is subsurface scattering, at least for now, but I will grab transmission, direct and indirect. And that should give me pretty much what I need. And you can just hit this arrow here to add it to active AOVs. And so now when I render, you'll see, or at least in the next render, you'll see that I'll have these nice renders. So I will now, now that I have this, I'm going to just kind of zoom in here. You'll notice that the vehicle already has a car paint, but we're going to be focusing on this portion here. And I want to make sure that should be everything that I set. At least, yeah, we'll change some of these settings here in a second. But yeah, let's go ahead and now click on IPR and we'll see what this looks like. So you can see that this black plastic here, is coming in white because we just created a new material. So I will hit Control A, or I'll just simply go to, open up my attribute editor, and we can find the material that we have here. So I'm going to just select this, do output connection. So it just focuses on this, and then I can do input output connections again, and that'll give me my end plastic noise. So I will set our weight. So now we're just going to apply kind of the simple workflows that we just did. So this is going to be, this black plastic, and this is, coming in, pretty dark, so we'll start out with something like this. I think that'll help, and I'm using a studio HDR, so it may help actually to just take a look at this reference, from the studio example, so this, it does look like that lighting too that's in the studio is warmer, and I'm using fully neutral lights. So, and the only color that's coming is from my HDR. So knowing that, we'll just kind of keep going here, and you'll actually notice I didn't use diffuse roughness on the look dev materials, but in this case, the diffuse roughness is not the same as specular roughness. This is actually going to increase the roughness of the albedo. So you'll start to see, or the base color. And so you see if I increase that to 1, we get just kind of overall a rougher material. So, I increase that, a bit for anything that has that rougher surface. If it's a smoother object, then I'll leave that pretty low, or actually entirely off. And we're going to focus just on adding these micro details with this noise and breaking up these reflections here. I'm not going to add any, dirt or scratches or anything like that. That'll actually come in a later tutorial, so make sure to stick around for that. But for now, I'm going to just add just a nice subtle noise here. Now, you'll actually notice the render itself is really noisy. I'm going to stop this render. I'm going to take a look at, fixing this up a bit so we don't get all that noise. So there's a couple places where you can do that. And this is actually, why, I took a look at doing or looking at, these AOVs or these render elements here. And it's going to, help, break these down and, help give you a good understanding of where this noise is coming from. Now, for sure, we know that the noise is coming from our lights, right? Because I did not create, or I did not increase the samples. So at minimum, I would say it's good when you get to this point and you really want to start refining and cleaning up your renders through your look dev process, then just increase the samples. So nothing crazy, right? We got 3 lights here. So I'm going to just bump these up. Instead of 1 samples, 2. And I'm going to do that for each one of our lights and my dome light. So we have volume samples 2, and I'll just do samples up here to 2. All right. So I will actually now re-render that, and that should help clean up. So it already is starting to look a little bit better. If you want to actually compare renders, I'd recommend using snapshots. Actually, move pure ref here. So that stopped. So it's this little guy down here. So if you hit this arrow, it'll pop up snapshots, and you can see that I have this use snapshots folder. So it actually stores it. So if you want to kind of keep a log of your renders, and then whenever you want this to save a render, you just hit the little camera icon, and then there you go. And then now we can just kind of continuously, as we're refining, see the difference in, kind of what we're adding here. All right, to our material. So I'm also using smooth preview. So I'm hitting 3 on my keyboard because I'm not ready to like fully subdivide this mesh. So we have plastic noise. We've given this a little bit of diffuse roughness. We've given this a little bit of specular, and let's just keep going. So if I hit, play here, zoom in more on this, I can, lower this roughness just a bit, so it's maybe catching a little bit more highlights there, and I'll increase the weight. So now those highlights are really starting to come through. But if I look at my reference again, the thing that I want to see is this specular highlight's not perfect. Our specular highlight here is perfect. And so now we're going to take a look at how to really break that up. We're not going to mess with coat or anything right now, and we're just going to mess with these properties here. So if I grab plastic noise, and I want to create a new node here. And the purpose of this node that we're going to create is going to add noise onto our roughness. All right, so we need to have weight set to 1, our color set to white, but our roughness value is going to be what we're driving this imperfection here on the material. So in my hypershade, I'll hit tab, and you can take a look at just adding, a simple noise. So I do AI noise. So you want to make sure to use the AI nodes in procedurals. So whenever, hooking them up to standard surface or Arnold materials. So once I have that, I can just do a straight plugin of this into the specular roughness. Now, if you try to just do out color, watch what happens. It'll only add out color to specular color, which makes sense because this is an output of a color, which is an RGB value going into an RGB value here with color. And instead, what you want to do is go to out color. We essentially want to grab the red channel. So RGB, red, green, blue. We want to grab the red channel because now this is a grayscale value, which is black to white. And this will allow us to actually add this. Since it's only black to white, it'll allow us to plug this right into specular roughness, right? So I'm going to actually zoom in a little bit closer so you can see that. It was a little bit rough to see. So out color R, and we're just going to connect that into specular roughness. Again, we can't do out color because that's the combination of these. And when it comes to these values, like, if I, for example, like metalness or specular or roughness, any of these that need numbered inputs, you need to essentially give it a single vector. This is what these would be considered as just a vector value, or like kind of a scalar value if you come in from Unreal Engine and node-based materials. But anyways, we have that, and now you can already see what that's doing. Now, one of the things I really like and love about Arnold is that you can select a node and do this. You can hit this icon here where it says isolate selected, and look at that. It allows you to just view this node that you're adding. So it allows you to just say, okay, if I'm going in and adding essentially these really micro details and these micro breakdowns, I can do that just with this AI noise. So you can select this, and now, if you haven't used noise before, octaves is essentially going to kind of create a finer resolution pattern, but it's not the same as scale. And then you can give this distortion, just kind of randomize it even more. And then, those are really the only twos that I'll change. I mean, you can kind of see, the, I don't even know how to pronounce it, lacunarity. That's, if I hit Control Z, that's kind of the noise within the noise. So I'm going to leave that. I don't really need that. And then you have, amplitude, which is overall lightness and darkness. But with this noise here is really, really small. And we really want to break up these highlights because of that, right? And we're talking about really, really small. And this is also dependent on the scale of your scene. So, because I model to scale, I need a pretty larger scale. So depending on the scale of your model, you may have to go either down or up here. But I'm going to use something like 10. That'll give me this nice noise pattern here. Then now, from here, if I actually click off of isolate selected, just with this, now look at this. Look what we just did to this specular highlight, right? We're really kind of breaking that up really nicely. Now, the thing that's causing, I would say, the challenge here, or it doesn't look correct, is that it's either, white or black, right? So if we go back to isolate selected with this nose, we're getting a lot of contrast in here, right? So what you can do is lower that contrast by taking color 1, color 2. We'll leave kind of color 1 as black, which black, actually we may increase that, but let's just kind of lower this whiteness. So we're lowering the contrast now. And then if I change off isolate selected, what closer to black means is that black is going to make it more or less rough and more glossy. So it's going to get really, really shiny. So notice as I'm making this, darker and blacker, the reflections get really, really glossy. Okay, we got that. So instead, I'm going to, keep this contrast low here, maybe kind of increase that a bit. And you can change that and work within here. I would say that's completely fine. I've kind of worked within here. The other thing, since we're looking into adding in some new nodes, is you can add in what's called an AI range. And what an AI range does is it allows you to essentially take this output and clamp it and kind of create new input and outputs. So AI range, I didn't create that. There we go. So we have this. And now what I want to do, instead of taking this R channel straight into specular roughness, I want to take the out color first and put this into input. Now from this input, now I want to take this R channel from this range. So just adding this node, and we'll just do specular roughness. All right. And now that we have this, we can now look at this node, and we still have isolate selected on, and it's still very glossy. So what we want to do to reduce this roughness and make it less glossy is go to isolate selected. And now what you can do is start to work with the output min and max. And what the output min and max is going to just kind of still maintain that noise, but it's going to, keep this, either lighter or value. So you're changing the output values here, which is really, really powerful and gives you a lot of precision here to, again, maintain noise here. So if I want to actually keep this, a lot of contrast here, then go back to range, then I can lower this range and work within this range where I can either make it really contrasting. So you can think of like levels in Photoshop, or I can start to lower the contrast and then bring this up here where we get something that's maybe, this lighter gray, which means it's going to be more rough. So if I turn off isolate selection, now look at that, right? You start to get this noisy pattern here that's really breaking up these reflections. Then you can continue to play and refine with this. So I think this, gives you hopefully all that you need, at least to understand how to break up these reflections. All right, great. So I definitely like where that's at. The next thing that I want to do, so I'll kind of zoom back in here, stop this, and I want to now take a look at actually doing this nice wheel material here. So if I grab my pure ref here and kind of zoom in, we want to take a look at doing this, and you can see what's composing this. You can actually see that there's this metallic here with paint flakes, actually flakes here, and with coating. But in this instance, I'm going to leave the flakes for the car paint. And I'm going to just use the coating here with a metallic object. So I'm going to hold right click and do a assign new material. And I will just do a standard surface. And I'll just call this, M underscore metal wheel. Metal wheel coat. All right. So we have that. So we can kind of zoom in here a bit. I'm going to hit 3 to get smooth preview. So now we have this nice smooth render here of the mesh. So I will kick on IPR so we can take a look at this wheel. So you can see we just have the standard material here. And what I want to do is just take the base, set that to pure white, and looking again at this material, it's kind of this, off gray, mid gray material. I have a couple, you can see how different it looks in the outside lighting. It's getting a lot of blue from the sky. So be very careful when you're looking at these different material references. And if you're like, oh, this is like a dark blue. No, actually, it's getting most of that blue from the sky here. Because if we look at it inside a studio, more neutrally lit, maybe there's a little bit of warmth here. It looks definitely more of this kind of this gray material. And you can see actually, it looks like there's some splotchiness and noise and roughness on the surface of that metal, right? But now I can take this metal and I'm just going to output connections here and kind of keep track of the materials that I've been making. And I want to start with, giving this that nice metal base. So we have the base of white. We're going to bring this down to kind of this mid gray. And from here, I'll set this to a nice, metal. So that already gives me something pretty good. And instead of, lowering the roughness here and then moving on, you can see that now it starts to just look like this like black material, even though like this black, very shiny material. This is where you're going to need to use something like coat. So the base here is definitely rougher. It's definitely kind of this, machined metal here. We can kind of keep it maybe something around here with this roughness, and we'll keep the color, and I'll actually increase the weight. So we get something like this, and that's looking good. And from here, we'll keep, all other settings here the same. We'll now take a look at coat. Just by simply adding this coat here with this white value, now take a look at how that's really bringing this all together, right? And you can even lower this, make sure that it's really a nice and polished. And now you can start to see we're getting the dark metal with this coat, and it's looking really, really good, right? And from here, you can of course go back to your base coat now that we have a good idea of what this looks like, and you say, okay, this is just gonna be a little bit on the lighter side, a little bit on the darker side, but you can just refine and tweak this as you see fit, right? So I can maybe move to something that's probably a little bit closer to this reference here. And now this is the rear wheel, so I'll take a look at the this here. So we're getting pretty close, and it's getting there's a lot of light hitting it dead on. They probably just have a light just blasting it. You can see how perfect this lighting is all around. So in my case, my light's off at an angle, so no big deal. You can just kind of use this as long as you keep that in mind, and we'll just kind of work at it from here. So things are looking really nice. I like the overall detail. And what you can do is, you can see that there's a bit of noise here again on the metal. So what you can do is, you can just take these nodes, and hit, Shift D, grab these nodes like so, and plug them into the base here of the specular, because we want this clear coat here. Actually you can see this clear coat, it's a bit beat up here, right? So we can maybe actually beat that reflectiveness here. So I will take this AI noise, go to the RGB, and remember we need out color for input and then out color for AI range. That's going to go into the base here of the specular roughness. So we're taking this R channel because we only want single channel values, and we want to do specular roughness. And that's going to give us a bit of noise here. And you can see this was, when we originally made this, it was pretty rough. As in it's not going to give you a lot of highlights, but we want a little bit more to pick up here. So I'm going to actually hold Alt, right click, zoom in here, and zoom out. And we can see actually there's kind of this nice tint. It's kind of not a perfect grayscale. So, in that instance, I'll use this method where I take this wheel coat, and I'll select this mesh here and go to the color, and I'll just do this just to start. Please don't do this and then say, well, I drop everything and move on. But you can see we're a little bit closer, right? Because you have to keep in mind color space and whatnot, and display space. But from here, you can see, yeah, there's a little bit of this red maroon almost. So now I can kind of lower that. But what I want to do is go back to that roughness here and get a little bit more variation. So I'll take a look at using the isolate selected here with this, and now I can mess with my range. And once you have this range set up, lighter colors for roughness means that it's very rough. So I can bring back this and make this actually, darker for this glossiness here. And that'll give me kind of some nicer, more highlights. And now you can start to see we're getting more of those highlights on that base coat. But if I zoom in here really close, you can see that they're not perfect reflections, right? So that noise is helping. Now there are a lot of other nodes if you wanted to and if I do an AI cell, there's AI cell noise, and within cell noise, you can do straight up noise, noise 1, noise 2, cell 1, and there's a lot of different things that you can do here. But for now, I'll just stick with the simple noise just for simplicity's sake. But I wanted to let you know there are a bunch of other ones for sure. So this is giving us some good noise here, and we can maybe say, I'd actually say, what? Let's beat up that clear coat here, and I'll use that cell noise. And within the cell noise, I'll Shift D this AI range because this workflow has been working really well. And I'll take this out color and put it into input. And where I want to add this now is on the roughness of the coat. All right. So I will just grab this. No, I don't want color. I want the R channel, and I want to do coat roughness. All right. Now from here, if I isolate selected, you can see where we're at. And this is a very small, but it's not as small as the noise here. So we can kind of go up maybe a scale or two, and we'll increase the octaves This is using noise. Like cell is going to give you something like this. So maybe you can kind of play around with that. There's definitely a lot more contrast with that. And, there's Worley, there's alligator for leather, so definitely a lot of different settings. Actually, I like Worley too. And with 3 octaves, I think that'll be a good start. And then from here, I can increase, the scale, not by, so I did 10 for the other one. So this one's going to give me maybe some good noise to break this up here. And, I can play with these settings here. And from here, I'd want to go to this AI range. And I don't think I had smooth step on, but let's see, we'll keep that off just for now. And from here, I'd want this still to be very glossy, but I just want this noise in here. So that means it's going to be very light with some noise. So I go back down and I can open this up, maybe, 0.2 here, something like this. And this, we can take a look now, and we can start to see here that the specular coat is now breaking up a little bit. So there's a lot of different things you can do and mix and match. There's actually probably, different workflows that you can use. I mean, I'll take a look at doing refraction next because I want to make sure we keep moving. But now if we take a look at this, for our glass, I will set this to be a new material and I will use a standard surface material. All right, because now I want to take a look at doing what everybody really wants to see, which is glass, right? Or headlights. Okay, now the first thing that when it comes to headlights is if I actually go ahead, it's largely dependent on how you modeled it. So I'm going to stop this so it's not trying to render a bunch of glass and detail and whatnot. And if I go here and I grab this lens and I'm going to grab this piece. This is the piece right here, right? Headlights too. So I have this housing here that's going to be chrome, and then I have this chrome tip. So for these chrome pieces, I'll just select these and do new material and standard surface. So I'll call this M, I'll call it light chrome, right? Because if we take a look at our reference, you can kind of see what we're dealing with. These are, these chrome rings here and chromes on the inside with a bulb and everything. So if I take this now and just quickly set this to metallic, fully metallic, and we're going to bring this down quite a bit for the color, increase the specular weight, and this is really shiny chrome. And for this shiny chrome, I'm going to just really lower the roughness, right? And I'm not rendering it as we speak, but this is fairly straightforward. I know these settings. I'm not going to use any coding. So this is give me something that's going to give me a good chrome housing for the light. Now, here's the next important part is if you've downloaded the model, I gave you guys the model like this, where it had these 2 pieces set up like so. Like this, if I isolate, it was this model and this. So I had the diffuser that breaks up and gives you this nice pattern here, and then the lens. Now, when it comes to transmission and refraction, some render engines handle it a little bit differently. Now, in my case, for using Arnold, what I ended up doing was taking this and smoothing the lens first, and then combining it with this piece. Why? So it sees this as one entire solid object, right? Because if I don't do that, then you have to start looking into, different settings here and different thicknesses. But I tested a few things and I'll show you what I mean, right? So let me go ahead and hide this. And if I show what I have here, you can see this is what I have. Right? I have this combined. I did not subdivide the diffuser here, but I did subdivide the cover. So I subdivide that, combine them, and I have essentially this solid piece. Again, because if you take a look at these references, right? I mean, it's largely based off of that, right? I think I had, just some close-up shots here of the lights, and you can just see it in all of these shots, like this one here. So you can see that, it's the chrome housing, and then we have this thick piece here for the lens. So I'm using that to build the light. And from there, it's going to be largely dependent on the material. So the material actually is largely dependent on the model. So here we got all of this set up and we have our AI surface. So I'm going to, or excuse me, standard surface. So I'm going to call this just, lens clear. And from here with this lens, I'm going to select it now. And let's get over here now and start rendering. And let's see what we got. So you can see, obviously, it's fully opaque. We haven't even touched, transmission. So in order to work with transmission, I'll set my usual base coat and my base weight to 1, my specular weight to 1. And transmission, now I'll increase this and watch what happens. Once you set this to fully transparent, this is what happens. It says, okay, it's no longer an opaque or solid object. Light is now passing through. It's based off of this, right? So now if you see that the light's kind of coming through, you get the glossy reflection rays, the specular rays, then you get these refractions, right? So it passes through, bounces inside, and then bounces out. That's what we are recreating for transmission and refraction. All right. So with that, you can see that it's black. So we have to change one setting in our render settings, right? The reason that it's black is because the ray depth. So in render settings, you can see that under ray depth, it's set to specular 1. All right. Now, what that means is it's sending one light ray in here and then it's stopping inside. Right. So it's not able to bounce more and then bounce out. So watch what happens if I turn on the rendering and increase this specular to 2. And then from there, you can still see that it's pretty dark here. So then I have to increase this now to 3. There you go. You see that? You see how now it's bouncing a lot inside, and look at that refraction. Most of this work, and this is why when I modeled my vehicle, I said, just wait until we get to rendering. The reason I'm modeling it like this is so we're going to get all of this refraction from geometry and let the light do its work. There's obviously other ways you can do it with cheating and, shortcuts with normal maps and stuff like that. But this is going to give me just what I want, right? So I am really happy with kind of how this turned out. And of course, there's more that we can do with the light itself, the light material. So if I go back here, you can see that we have all of this. And the thing is, this is still at a roughness of 0.4. So now if I set this to 0, roughness, there you go. Now, instead of looking kind of like, oh, it was a little bit on the, hard to see through, now we're getting that. Now, it may not be. You can see actually in the reference, it's not perfectly like glossy, but we're going to bring up the roughness just a bit, something like that. And this will give us something nice to work with. And then you can use what's also called depth. So depth will, give you, make the material look thinner. So if depth is 0, it's thicker. And as you increase it, it'll start to appear thinner. So, you can mess with that and get some good results. I'll leave this kind of thick here. And pretty much all set with that. I think that covers all the main things that I want to cover about the light. And you can see what I ended up doing here for these tail lights as well. They're dark actually because I don't have the lights on here in the back. So okay, they were actually dark because I had multiple groups showing, but here you can see how these turned out, right? And these look really, really nice. They have all of these nice details, and you can see, again, this is exactly what I was trying to achieve here with, modeling all of this detail. Now, I don't have anything illuminating on the inside, but this is going to give us that nice ray trace detail. So this is all working together. Now, in this case, I ended up keeping these pieces separate. So if I actually hide this, you'll see that these are all separate. This ended up working better. And the other thing that I have to let you know is that this red taillight is actually composed of a top clear coat or top clear version. So if you get in real close, this is what always trips people up with taillights, right? Is that this top base is a clear plastic, and then inside of that is the red. So if you set your renders up like that and you set your models up like that, it's going to look, really, really nice once you start setting everything up, right? So that's looking good. And you really have to let Arnold and the ray tracer do its thing too. So, but I'm really happy with how this turned out. And, it's got a chrome housing on the inside too. So if I go on the inside, it's got these chrome pieces as well. So we have all these different layers working together. We have this clear light lens here. And then inside of that light lens, you have the red color transmission. And the red color here is just essentially this color set up. And yeah. Then the other thing is I had to use what's called thin walled, because I did not combine this with thickness. You can see that it's one-sided. I had to use what's called thin walled. And without that, you don't get that nice refraction on the inside. All right. So that gives us, all that information. That's a rundown on refraction. And I'm at the limit here. I try to keep my tutorials around 1 hour max. So now that I'm about an hour or probably over now, we will do like a part 2 on this, and where I'll start looking at doing more plastic, more details, more chrome. You can see what I have here for this chrome piece, and this is all still part of that like introductory part of the materials and look dev process, because there's an entire layer where I'm eventually going to take this car and really kind of beat it up even more, and I'm going to add more dust and grunge and dirt. So instead of this nice perfectly pristine car, I'm going to take it from this pristine car and really show you how to dirty it up and make it look like it probably just came back from the racetrack, right? So we have all of that. Actually, I'm going on the other side. That's where all my lighting is, right? And you can see actually how I did the sidewall here with the normal map and whatnot. So really happy overall how everything is starting to look. And I will cover this all in, future tutorials. And here's where I ended up. I'm still working on the material refinements, but I'm taking you guys on this journey as I do all the lighting and materials for the Datsun. You'll see that this is actually quite a bit slower too, because I'm really started increasing the noise information with GPU. I really just bumped up the camera AA, and if you switch from CPU to GPU, you're only using camera A. So you have to really crank that up. Once you do that, it really starts to clean it up. But, some of my favorite shots here, you really start to get into this area here. And just by kind of breaking this up, I mean, look how nice that headlight looks. Look how nice that blinker looks. The wheels are starting to come together really nicely. All of these layers, and they're not using perfect reflections either, right? So I have all of this, and I'll be covering this in future tutorials for sure. So make sure to, subscribe, like, comment, let me know. For those that are using V-Ray, I'm going to make a lot of V-Ray tutorials, because I do feel like V-Ray, there's not a lot of love for V-Ray and Maya on YouTube. So I'm definitely going to be doing more tutorials. So take a look. If you want to grab the model again, the model is right here on this resto mod. You can find that, plus any of the other models. And I'm going to continue to build this up. And, some people reached out just looking just to support my content and channel. Everything's free. All the tutorials are. But if you want models, you can, support my channel by grabbing these here. Or you can, do a simple buy me a coffee. I'm looking into doing a Patreon where I give access people, the working files. I give people access to the models, give people early access tutorials. I'm doing a bit of research on that, so please give me any suggestions. Give me your thoughts. Again, my tutorials will all stay free, and it's more of like just a bonus if you want source files and whatnot, and access to unedited or real-time videos, I should say, where I have time lapses and stuff. But anyways, this is definitely going to be a multi-part video series on materials, look dev. So make sure to, subscribe and follow along as I do that. Also, if you are just itching for more Arnold rendering content, be sure to check out Arvind here. So, Arvid has a ton of YouTube free Arnold tutorials, and he's definitely a go-to video series on learning anything Arnold related. He's just got such a great amount of content out there, which is part of the reason why I will cover Arnold, but I will probably not go as in depth since he covers so many things that I would want to cover, but I will cover in Maya and V-Ray and other render engines like Unreal Engine and and Blender cycles and whatnot. So definitely check him out. Shout out to him and his channel and his content. It's fantastic. So yeah, I will see you guys around. Let me know if you have any questions, and take care. And sorry if this ran a little bit over an hour, but there's just so much to cover here. So I'll do my best, to create a good series here. So take care and see you around.